lost in the jungle. The jungle doesn't let you leave. It watches. It listens. It waits for you to falter. And when you do, it swallows you whole. I learned this the hard way. It started with gunfire, short bursts, then a roar of chaos. The Japanese had found us. We weren't a combat unit, just a ragtag group of engineers, radio operators, and supply runners. But the bullets didn't care. They tore through trees, skin, bone. We scattered, slipping into the undergrowth, our bodies moving on instinct. I ran, feeling the wet slap of leaves against my face, the ground sucking at my boots. The air was thick with smoke, but the jungle had its own kind of darkness. It devoured the light, swallowed the echoes of gunfire, and within minutes, it felt like I was the only one left. The radio was dead weight on my back. I should have ditched it. Every step I took, it reminded me of my role, the guy who was supposed to call for help. But who was left to answer? The base? A voice in the void? I pressed forward, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that I wasn't already a ghost. Then came the first night. New Guinea's jungle wasn't just trees and vines. It was something alive, something ancient. The air was thick, damp, humming with sounds that didn't belong in any world I understood. Insects, yes, but also the low, guttural calls of things unseen. The shadows stretched and twisted, and my body, wired with exhaustion, refused to rest. I told myself to keep going, keep moving. But where? Deeper. Always deeper. Because the alternative was going back. And back meant death. I wasn't alone. Not for long. By the time the moon had clawed its way through the canopy, I heard movement. I gripped the knife at my belt, my breath locked in my chest. Then a whisper, more breath than words. A name? Plea? It was enough to make my blood freeze. I wasn't ready when the hand clamped onto my shoulder. I spun around, my knife slashing through the darkness. The blade meant nothing but air, but the movement saved me. Because if I had stayed still, I might have driven it straight into the man standing before me. It was Corporal Davis. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with mud and something darker. Blood? His own? Someone else's? He didn't speak, just clutched my arm like a drowning man. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes, God, his eyes, looked like they'd seen something worse than bullets. I should have been relieved. I wasn't alone. But the jungle didn't let you feel safe. Not even for a second. Davis finally found his voice, barely more than a whisper. We have to move. I wanted to ask what he had seen, but the way he kept glancing over his shoulder told me I didn't want the answer. So we moved. For hours, we pushed through the undergrowth, every step slower, more agonizing. My body screamed for rest, but the fear kept us upright. By dawn, we found a river, black water, sluggish and reeking of decay. A body lay, half submerged near the bank. One of ours, or what was left of him. His helmet was gone, his face bloated beyond recognition. The jungle had already started reclaiming him. Davis clenched his jaw. We need to get across. The river wasn't wide, but it might as well have been an ocean. The current was slow, but the water was thick with things that moved just beneath the surface. I swallowed hard. You sure about this? He didn't answer. He just stepped in. The water swallowed his legs, then his waist. I followed, every muscle tensed, waiting for something to brush against my skin, waiting for the river to pull me under. We moved carefully, our rifles held high, the radio pack balanced on my shoulders like some kind of cruel joke. Halfway across, Davis stopped. I barely had time to react before he was yanked downward. There was no scream, no struggle, just a splash in a void where he had been. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I lunged, my hands plunging into the water, grasping for anything, his arm, his gear, his damn soul if I had to. My fingers, brushcloth. I pulled with everything I had. Davis came up gasping, coughing out filth. His eyes were wild, his body shaking. What? I started, but he cut me off. Keep moving. His voice was raw, barely human. I didn't argue. We reached the other side, collapsing onto the mud, our bodies shaking with exhaustion. I didn't ask what had pulled him under. Some things, I realized, were better left unknown. But the jungle knew. It always knew. By the time we crawled onto the far bank, the weight in my limbs had become unbearable. as if the jungle itself had wrapped around me, pressing me into the earth. My breath came in ragged gulps, and Davis, lying beside me, was no better. His hands were still trembling, his skin pale beneath the layer of grime. Whatever had taken hold of him in the river had left its mark, though he wouldn't speak of it. He simply lay there, his chest rising and falling, staring up at the twisted canopy above us, eyes unfocused, lost in some silent horror. I forced myself upright, ignoring the burning in my legs, the dull ache in my shoulders from the weight of the radio. It was useless out here. No signal, no contact, just dead weight on my back, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was the last thread tying me to the world beyond this jungle, a world where help might still exist, where we were more than just two ghosts drifting through a dying landscape. The air was thick with the scent of rotting vegetation, heavy and suffocating, carrying with it the distant hum of unseen insects and the rustling of things that moved just beyond our vision. Every sound was magnified in the oppressive silence between us, and as I looked at Davis, I saw something in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't just afraid, he was unraveling. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice hoarse, my throat raw from dehydration. He didn't respond at first, just kept staring at the trees, his fingers twitching against the mud. Then slowly, he pushed himself up, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a man waking from a nightmare he couldn't quite escape. "There's something out here," he murmured, barely audible. I wanted to tell him that of course there was. Snakes, insects, enemy patrols. Death was everywhere, waiting for us to make a mistake. But that wasn't what he meant. The way he said it, the way his gaze flickered over my shoulder as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I didn't press him. There was no point. We moved deeper into the jungle, our steps slow, deliberate, careful not to disturb whatever unseen presence lay coiled in the darkness around us. The sun, barely visible through the tangled branches above, gave no comfort. Its light was weak, choked by the dense foliage, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move even when we stood still. Every root and vine felt like a snare waiting to tighten, every distant rustle a whisper of something unseen watching from the undergrowth. Then the smell hit us. At first, it was faint, carried on the sluggish breeze, a sickly sweet rot that clung to the back of my throat and made my stomach twist. Then it grew stronger, more suffocating, until it became impossible to ignore. Davis stopped abruptly, his body rigid, and I followed his gaze to the trees ahead. Something hung from the branches. Several things. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. Shapes swaying gently in humid air, twisted and broken. Then the details sharpened, and my breath caught in my chest. Bodies. Soldiers, American, British, maybe even Australian. Their uniforms rotted, their flesh blackened with decay. Strung up like warnings, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, their faces frozen in expressions of silent agony. Some were missing pieces, limbs gnawed away, torsos hollowed out as if something had burrowed inside. Flies swarmed thick around them, their droning hum filling the air like a death chant. Davis made a choking sound beside me, his hand clamped over his mouth. I swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that rose in my throat, my mind racing to make sense of it. The Japanese? Some sadistic execution meant to break the spirits of anyone who stumbled across it? Or something else? Something worse? Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We moved past the hanging corpses as quickly as our shaking legs would allow, careful not to look too closely, careful not to let our minds linger on what had been done to them. But the smell stayed with us, clinging to our skin, seeping into our clothes, a reminder that we weren't supposed to be here, that we had wandered into something far older, far darker than war itself. By the time night fell, we had found shelter beneath the roots of a massive tree, its gnarled form twisting upward like the skeletal remains of some ancient beast. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and for the first time since the ambush, exhaustion won out over fear. We didn't speak. We just collapsed into the dirt, letting the weight of our bodies sink into the ground, too drained to care about the things that lurked beyond the edge of our vision. Sleep didn't come easily. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't rest, it was something else. A descent into something dark and formless, a place where the jungle whispered in a language I couldn't understand, where unseen things moved just beyond the edges of my dreams. And then I heard the voice. Faint at first, a distant murmur carried on the wind, but growing louder, insistent. Not words, not exactly, but something deeper, something older, something that clawed its way into my skull and refused to let go. I snapped awake, my pulse hammering against my ribs, my skin slick with cold sweat. The jungle was silent, too silent. Beside me, Davis was sitting up, his back to me, his posture stiff. His head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. My stomach clenched. Davis. He didn't move. I reached out, my hand hesitant, my fingers barely brushing his shoulder. Then slowly he turned to face me. And I knew in that moment that whatever looked back at me wasn't Davis anymore. His eyes weren't right. In the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, they gleamed too bright, too wide, reflecting something that wasn't there. His pupils were dilated, the whites too stark against the darkness of his face, as if something had hollowed him out and left only the shell. His mouth hung slightly open, his breath slow, measured, deliberate in a way that sent a cold, creeping terror down my spine. I didn't move. Barely breathe. The jungle pressed in around us, suffocating, watching. I could hear the insects, the distant rustling of unseen creatures, but beneath it all, I swore I could still hear that voice, the one from my dreams. No, not my dreams. It had never been a dream. It had been something else, something that had reached into me while I slept, something that had called to Davis. My fingers twitched toward my knife, a slow, careful movement. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but every nerve in my body screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. Davis's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then he stood up. The motion was too smooth, too fluid, as if his joints no longer carried weight, as if something else was guiding his limbs. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond me, staring through me rather than at me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, my body frozen between the instinct to run and the sickening realization that there was nowhere to go. Davis, I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. This time, he reacted. His head snapped toward me, his movements jerky, unnatural. His lips curled slightly, forming something that might have been a smile in another life, but here, in this moment, it was something else. Something wrong. You hear it, don't you? His voice was quiet, distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere far away. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, that the jungle was getting to him, but the words wouldn't come, because I had heard it. And I still did. It wasn't a voice in the way the human voices worked. It wasn't sound, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that pressed against my skull, that wrapped around my ribs and settled in my lungs, making it harder to breathe. A pull. A whisper beneath the skin. Davis took a step forward. I took a step back. He blinked slowly, his head tilting to the side, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I saw something flicker in his expression, something almost human. Fear. Then it was gone. His hands clenched at his sides, his breath coming faster, uneven, and when he spoke again, it wasn't his voice. Not really. It was layered, distorted, like something else was speaking through him. It's waiting. I didn't wait to find out what he meant. My body moved before my mind could catch up. My hand closed around my knife, my feet digging into the damp earth as I turned and ran, my heart hammering against my ribs. The jungle was a blur around me, branches tearing at my arms, roots grabbing at my ankles, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Davis didn't follow. Or maybe he didn't need to. Because the whispering was louder now, and it was coming from everywhere. I don't know how long I ran, only that at some point, my legs gave out and I collapsed into the dirt, my chest heaving, my vision swimming. The jungle loomed around me, endless, stretching into eternity, and I realized, with a sinking dread, that I was lost. More lost than I had ever been. Because when I looked up, the sky was gone. The trees above me had twisted together, sealing out the stars, the moon, the last remnants of the world I had known. The air was thicker here, heavy, pressing down on my skin like a living thing. The ground was soft beneath my fingers, too soft, as if it had been disturbed recently, as if something had been buried here. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle trembling, my knife still clutched in a death grip. I had to move. I had to find my way out. But as I turned, I felt it. The presence. Not just watching. Not just waiting. Closer now. And when I finally gathered the courage to look over my shoulder, I saw the shape standing at the edge of the trees. Not Davis. Not human. Something older. Something that had been waiting long before we ever stepped foot in its jungle. And as it stepped forward, the whispering finally stopped, because it didn't need to call to me anymore. I was already here, and there was no way out.